Now it's time for the most recognizable of Petit Four, the colorful Fondant Glaze Petit Four. And I get to show you how to make your own fondant, a rolling fondant and a pouring fondant. The first one to make, though, is the rolling fondant. The first step is to bloom agar powder. You find agar where you buy cake decorating supplies. And I'm going to add a tablespoon plus a quarter teaspoon to a third of a cup of cool water. Agar is a type of seaweed, and its function in a recipe like this is to absorb water. I'll just give this a little stir, and this is a process you don't want to rush on, so I'm going to let this sit for at least 5 minutes. That gives me enough time to get my cake in the oven. And this really is a nice, easy cake. It's a marzipan cake. I have 200 grams of marzipan. Marzipan's simply an almond paste made with almonds, honey, and sugar. Now, since I have to work this into my cake batter right off the top, I find it easiest to just grate the marzipan on a box grater. I have 3/4 of a cup of unsalted butter in my mixing bowl, and I'm going to add that same amount of granulated sugar to it. And even before I start the mixer, I can add that grated marzipan. And now I'll beat this until it's nice and smooth. And to this base, I add 4 whole eggs. So I'll start the mixer and add the eggs one at a time, waiting until the first egg is blended before I add the next one. There we go. And lastly, I'll sift 3/4 of a cup of cake and pastry flour and add that to this mixture. And I just have to mix this until it's blended. For this cake, you use a jelly roll pan. That's a cake pan that has a bit of a lip to it. 10 by 15 is the ideal size. And I'm going to spread the batter to level. All right, this is all set for the oven, which I've preheated to 375, and this cake takes about 20-25 minutes. I have one I've already made and let cool fully so I can show you how to assemble this cake. Let me grab a cutting board and then tipping it out of the pan and pulling away the parchment. All I need to do is cut it in half. And now I'm gonna make a sandwich out of this cake. I've got some raspberry jam, and I'll spoon on all but about 2 tablespoons of this jam. And just spread this evenly across the cake. There we go. I'll place this layer right on top, and the remaining 2 tablespoons of jam goes on top in a very thin layer, because this jam is the glue that's going to hold the layer of rolling fondant that goes on top. Now, I'll just set this aside for a minute. Now it's time for me to show you how to make rolling fondant. So the agar that I've softened in my 3rd cup of water, I now need to dissolve. When you no longer see granules of the agar powder, then you know it's dissolved. Okay, so you know I'm a butter girl, but this is one time you actually need to use vegetable shortening, 2 tablespoons that I'll dissolve into the agar. Also, sugar in liquid form, 1/2 cup of white corn syrup. And the last ingredient to add is a tablespoon of glycerin. Now, this is an essential ingredient in rolling fondant. It keeps your fondant from getting too sticky, and it keeps your colors pure. I'm gonna bring over a big bowl of icing sugar. I've sifted 4.5 cups of icing sugar, and I'm just going to pour this all right in. So just keep adding icing sugar until it starts coming together almost like a cookie dough. So now that you can see it's starting to become difficult to stir, I'm actually going to turn it out onto my rolling surface. And then just knead it by hand. Use your sense of touch. Just get right in there. And see how smooth and silky it's becoming? It feels firm to the touch. It holds my fingertips when I press it in, so it's ready to roll. Now to roll, I do have a special rolling pin intended for fondant. I'm rolling this out the size of my cake. That way I can cover it. I think we're good. And I'm going to use the pin to make space. Bring over my cake and then roll it right on top. So I'm going to trim the fondant off. There we go. I do find it a good idea to wrap this and freeze it for an hour or two before you cut out your petit four shapes. Now I'm set to pop this in the freezer. I'll leave it for a little while, then it'll be time to cut out my little petit four shapes and glaze them with that pouring fondant. A pouring fondant is the perfect way to add polish to petit four, and that's exactly what it's time to do. I've got my cake ready, nicely chilled and covered with the rolling fondant, so now it's time to get it ready for the pouring fondant. I like to cut out round petit four simply because they're easier to glaze, no corners. I push them up from the bottom, that way I don't bruise that top layer. Now, these little scraps are just as delicious as these beautiful petit fours, so I'm not going to throw them away. You can always freeze them and recut different petit fours if you wanted to. And now it's time to make that pouring fondant. I have 2/3 of a cup of hot tap water, and I'll add to that a 1/4 cup of corn syrup. I'm using the glycerin again to keep my pouring fondant fluid, just the way it keeps the rolling fondant nice and smooth for rolling. And this time I'm going to add a little flavor, a little bit of almond extract, since the cake itself has the marzipan in it. So all of this I whisk into 8 cups of sifted icing sugar. Give it a good mix just to make sure it's nice and smooth. There we go. Now's the perfect opportunity to add a little color if you want. You want to add a little at a time when you're using paste color, which does color pouring fondant so beautifully. So I'll start with that and see if I need to add more. I think that is a perfectly lovely pink. So now, what is most important when you're using pouring fondant is the temperature. That's why I added hot tap water to get the consistency I want. And then you want to use a candy thermometer or instant read thermometer to check your temperature. 105 is ideal. So I've got a water bath ready, a pot with about 1 inch of water, and I'm going to bring that up to a simmer and just whisk this to warm it up gradually. The reason that temperature is specific is for the ideal satin finish. I'm almost there. It's better to heat it gradually than try and rush the process. All right, now I'm ready to pull it off the heat. And then I like to ladle my fondant, and I want to do it in a single pour. Let's keep it fluid. And before it sets, you can always add a little decor. I'm a big fan of dragée. Now, aren't these just the sweetest things?